This conference will now be recorded.
Good day, everyone, whatever it is in your time zones. Welcome back to this Astronaut Mentality webinar series. Last webinar, which was yesterday, we focused on resilience, coping, and MacGyvering when needed. We learned that resilience and coping go hand in hand, where you have to science the space out of it sometimes. And what we want to make sure you know is this is a Project PoSSUM series. And if this is your first time here, no worries. Project PoSSUM is a nonprofit organization where we study polar suborbital science in the upper mesosphere and many other hands-on astronautic and citizen science training and research where anyone can participate in real science and not just be a passenger. I want to go ahead and introduce our moderator today, Dr. Shauna Pandya, and I want to go ahead and hand over to
Yeah, thanks, Shayla. So thanks for everyone who attended yesterday. Thanks for those of you who are back today. We'll take it as a sign that we're doing something right. Thanks to and welcome to our brand new viewers. So today we have an amazing speaker and an amazing panel. But before we get into that, we're just going to get into some of the comments from yesterday. We threw out the hashtag PoSSUM Astronaut Mentality. That's the hashtag we're using throughout this series. So we ask you to tell us what you're doing to stay resilient and how you're coping and what your hacks are during this time. So from Raul, we got, how am I staying resilient? I see this as space away from the noise of daily life, and he is taking this time to be creative and work on his Netflix TV series, which will start filming at the end of the year, assuming the pandemic settles. Hirsch says that his advice is to busy yourself in the small things, like he is with helping his mom and keeping his day busy with his friends. So that is some of the comments that we had from Facebook. And then just one outstanding question that we had at the end of yesterday that we didn't quite get to. Someone asked how one goes about pushing the limits, how you go about becoming more extreme. And actually, I was going to answer that, but then I realized our panel today is perfectly qualified to answer that. So I will keep you in suspense, and I will actually take this as a perfect segue to introduce our amazing panel. So today we're talking about the Astronaut Mentality Part 2, Lessons Learned from Previous Selections. And the lineup we have is fantastic. As keynote, we have Dr. Cyan Proctor. Cyan's bio, I'll only read you parts of it because if we read everyone's bios, that would be the whole hour. But she is a geoscientist, explorer, science communications expert with a passion for space exploration. She has numerous experience from previous analog missions, including a 4-month stay at High Seas in Hawaii and the all-female Sensoria mission. And relevant to today, she was placed top 47 in the 2009 NASA selection. On our panel today, we have just as amazing of a series of panelists for you. From the States, we have Dr. Uliana Horodoshki. She was top 20 in the 2017 NASA class. She is a Fulbright scholar, PhD in glaciology, has been to all 7 continents and performed research at Antarctica. And in fact, she just got back from there. And she's also CEO and founder of Science in the Wild, a science adventure company. Next up, and returning again, we have Kyle Foster, image scientist with over a decade of experience in research, engineering, analytic and research roles, a seasoned analog astronaut, having experienced the 30-day Hera mission and the 5-day underwater Neptune mission. He was qualified as a basic qualificant in the last astronaut selection and has applied again this year. And next up, we have Bailey Burns from Colorado, USA, at the Colorado School of Mines, a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a minor in Economics and Business, and currently pursuing a master's in Space Resources. Bailey is here to give us her perspective as a first-time applicant, and she is currently completing her private pilot's license, and near and dear to my heart, she is a 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo. And last but not least, who will be arriving a little bit later today to give us the perspective from the Canadian selection is Dr. Aaron Prasad, who is currently a fellow at MIT and has previously completed degrees at the University of Toronto in biomedical engineering science and has flown multiple payloads to the International Space Station. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to the amazing Dr. Cyan Proctor to give us her keynote on her lessons learned from the astronaut selection.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to switch over to share my screen here and go into the PowerPoint view mode. Okay, so everybody see the main screen? Great. Thank you for having me today to talk about my experience and the lessons that I've learned from the previous astronaut selection. I want to the objective today is to get insight into our experiences and some of the things that the takeaways that we had from that. To get into depth about my experience, I first have to give you a little bit of my background and how I ended up applying for the astronaut selection process. I know a lot of you have been working your entire careers to apply, but my story is a little bit more unique. This is some of my background. I'm a geoscientist. I've been teaching for 21 years at a community college. I'm also an explorer and science communicator, so I've done a lot of things around the world. And in the last 10 years, I've become an analog astronaut living in Moon and Mars simulations around the world. My story really begins on the island of Guam. I was born on Guam because my father, he worked for NASA during the Apollo missions. And so we were on Guam from 1966 to 1970. And there's a tracking station on Guam. And what's interesting is that I like to consider myself to be a moon baby because I was born 8.5 months after Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. And they used to have these splashdown parties. And so I grew up with certificates on my wall that on my dad's office wall from NASA. And so this is one that he got from the Apollo 11 mission. And Neil Armstrong actually came to Guam after Apollo 11, and my dad got to meet him and got his autograph. So in the lower right-hand corner, it says, "To Ed, thanks for all the help, Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11." So I grew up with this in our house. Space was a part of who we were to some extent because of my dad's legacy. Now, once I was born, we left Guam, and my dad left the Apollo mission, but his love for space and space exploration was always still there. I grew up really into military aviation. My dream was to become an F-16 fighter pilot. And what's funny is, if you all remember Top Gun, I'm kind of a Top Gun generation. My whole thing growing up was I was going to become a fighter pilot, and then I was going to obviously become the shuttle commander, because how hard could that be, right? My dad put me in the Civil Air Patrol, so I did that up through high school. And then a couple of things happened that kind of derailed me from wanting to pursue becoming a military aviator and then eventually an astronaut. And the first was I got glasses, and that doesn't deter you from being an astronaut, but you couldn't be a military aviator. And I had always seen the road to the shuttle through being a military pilot. And so I knew at age 15, 16 that I was not going to be a military aviator. And then my father passed away when I was a teenager, and he had always been my biggest support. And so I just kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. Now, my father didn't have a college degree, and yet he was very successful as a scientist and an engineer. But his big dream for me and my siblings was for us to go off to college. And so I ended up going and getting my degrees and then becoming a full-time professor at South Mountain Community College. I just finished my 21st year there. And one of the great things about being a geoscientist is that I've been able to travel around the world. And so I got scuba certified. I finally got my pilot's license because I always wanted to fly. And I just lived my life. I was just doing my thing. And I didn't even know how NASA selected astronauts. And so one of the things I want to know is, on our panel here, who here actually applied for this most recent astronaut selection process. And so you can either type in the chat yes or no, or you can participate in the poll. And the way you do that is you text Cyan Proctor 300 first to 37607 at the top there, and then that will allow you to join, and then you just select A or B. And so if you can take a moment and fill that out, then we'll be able to see how many people here applied for the ASTRO program listening right now. So hopefully everybody's trying to reply or looking in the reply in the chat. And so Shona, I'll ask you if there's replies in the chat that you want to say. Oh, we got other people coming in. So we're at 33% yes and 67% no at the moment. I'll give a few more minutes. And you can only reply to this if you're from your phone or from your computer. If you're on your phone listening, then that would be a little more difficult, I think, for you to participate in this poll. Okay, I'm going to give it 30 more seconds. And so I will tell you that I did not apply for the NASA astronaut selection this year. And the reason why is because I just turned 50. And even though that doesn't necessarily deter you from being selected, I'm only a few years out from being retired. And as much as I would love to be an astronaut, I'm kind of looking forward to not having that stress the second half of my life. And so I'm looking forward to retiring and exploring Earth and doing some of the other things I've been doing. I really love being an analog astronaut. Now, don't get me wrong. If the opportunity to go to space came up, I would take it. I just don't know if through NASA is the right road for me. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so we can see that most of the people on the call did not apply. 38% of you did apply. So this last astronaut selection process was really interesting because the requirements actually changed. I'm going to talk about the requirements when I went through the selection process in 2009. But in this one, you had to have a master's degree in a STEM field. In previous ones, you just had to have a bachelor's degree in a STEM field. So they upped the game a little bit. And one of the reasons why is because they got so many applicants the last time. And so you can see the requirements, the basic requirements that NASA is looking for, but they're also looking for a couple of other things. In 2009, when the call came out, they were looking for these requirements specifically if you were not coming through the military pilot track. So that's a different set of requirements. And so what's interesting is like I was saying, I was just living my life. And then at age 38, I got an email from a friend that said, NASA's looking for astronauts, you should apply. And I was like, what? And I opened up the USA Jobs. I didn't even know how they selected astronauts. And then I saw the qualifications and I realized I had a PhD. I had my pilot's license. I was scuba certified. I don't speak any Russian, but I had cultural experience because I traveled and taught around the world. And so one of the things I thought was like, okay, I'm qualified. Now I just got to get up the nerve to actually apply. And I'm so glad I did, because a lot of times we'll talk ourselves out of things. Being a community college professor, it was easy for me to say, oh, they'll never select me. I'm just a community college professor in Phoenix. I'm nobody. They're not going to really look at me. But that's what's neat about NASA and the astronaut selection process, is that anybody with these qualifications can apply and potentially be selected. So in 2009, they had roughly 3,500 people applied. And out of that, NASA screens out more people apply than are actually qualified. So then they look and say, okay, who's qualified? And it turned out that about 79% of the people who applied were actually qualified. And then they go through this process of saying, well, who's highly qualified? And they generally pick around 450 people who are going to be considered highly qualified. That means you might have your scuba certification or your pilot's license, or you have some really interesting, unique characteristics that make you stand out beyond just the minimal qualifications. And then you typically get notified that you're the highly qualified when they ask you to take a flight to medical. They'll also begin to do reference checks if they're serious about you. So I found out that I was highly qualified and that they were interested in interviewing me when I was walking across my campus, and my division chair, I just happened to run into her, and she's like, somebody from NASA keeps calling about you, some guy named Melvin, Leland Melvin. I'm like, Leland Melvin, the astronaut? And she's like, oh, okay, I better get back to him then. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. An astronaut was inquiring about me and my references. And then one day you get a call. And it was from Johnson Space Center, and they said, hey, we want to invite you down. Congratulations, you've made the first round interviews. In 2009, they selected 110 first round interviews. And what they do is they fly you down to Johnson Space Center for 3 days. At least that's what they did in 2009. And you're brought in groups of 10. And it was either Sunday, Monday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And so you overlapped on Wednesday with another group of 10. And so you get to meet each other. And the first thing that you realize is that you're surrounded by amazing people that you're just like, what am I doing here? And so if you look in this picture, you'll notice the person who's to my left. And some of you might recognize who that is. Maybe in the chat, if you know, put that person's name. And so I was blown away by the amazing people. I mean, of course, they're all trying to be an astronaut. And so that's one of the benefits, is that you meet people who are just really interesting. It's like being part of Project PoSSUM. I mean, just really interesting, dedicated, qualified, determined individuals. And so that was my group that came down, and two of the people in this photo are astronauts. One, if you wrote it in, Jessica Meir, who's on the International Space Station right now, and then Mark, he's also an astronaut, and he's flown already. What was interesting, I should go back and mention that this selection was the first selection, the 2009 one, where they knew that you weren't going to fly on the shuttle. The shuttle would be retired, and that you were specifically going to be working towards being on the International Space Station. Just like the newest class for the 2020 is going to be Artemis. So they typically, NASA knows when they're selecting astronauts, kind of what the mission is and what you're going to be doing, whether it was building the ISS or, you know, doing the shuttle, or living on the ISS, or going to the moon. So what's fun about going for the first round interviews is that I got to meet a lot of astronauts. A lot of times people are really excited about the fact that you're going to fly and go into space, but a lot of the job, in 10 years, you're lucky if you'll go up even once into space. And so all of the astronauts have regular jobs that they're assigned to. And so they wanted us to talk and interact with them to find out whether or not this is something that we really wanted to do, that we knew that there was this whole other part or life to being an astronaut beyond just flying. But then there's also the cool things. They take you on all these tours, and of course I was really interested in the flight aspect of becoming an astronaut, because you have to fly every month and keep up on your flying. And because I wanted to be a military aviator when I was a kid, that was one of the things I was super excited about. But they also tested, you on your ability to do an EVA, that's the lower left-hand corner, and just different kinds of little cognitive tests along with interviews. And so then after that, you go home and you wait. And so I was 38 at the time, and then I turned 39, and I was celebrating the fact that I'd made the top 110, and I got to be with all these amazing people and meet astronauts and go on tours and all of those things. Because if you've heard of imposter syndrome, I was like, what am I doing here? You know, how there must be a mistake. And you wait to see if you're going to become a finalist. But again, I had just kind of resigned myself that there's no way I'm moving on, because these people I'm with are amazing. And one day the phone rang, and from the first interview of 110, NASA decided to select 47. And I remember the phone ringing early in the morning, and I thought to myself before answering, I'm like, oh, it must be my mom, because my mom is the only person who calls at, 7 a.m. And it was Johnson Space Center. And they said, hello, this is Johnson Space Center. And I remember just going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And she started laughing, and she's like, yes, we'd like to invite you down for a second interview. Congratulations, you're now a finalist for the astronaut selection process. And I just couldn't believe it. And so this time they fly you down for a full week. And I was in a group of 7. So that was the 7 people that I went down to Johnson with. And this one is more intense. You've got another interview, but now you've got full medical tests. You still do tours. It's a lot of fun, but you really get into the medical side. I mean, they test everything medically, because they are looking for anything that could potentially disqualify you. And so whether it's your lung capacity, this one with me in the lower right, I'm wearing a heart rate monitor for 24 hours, and I had to do my interview with a panel of astronauts. So you can imagine the stress level. And I kept thinking, my heart's going to be beating so fast that this is going to disqualify me alone. One of the fun things is the colonoscopy. So the day before, you have to purge. So we all bought NASA shot glasses to drink the stuff that, helps you, clears you out. And then the MRI scan, that's actually my brain right there. And so it came back grossly normal, which I found entertaining. And so the medical, literally, they look at everything: eyes, ears. I found out that I had freakishly small ear canals as a result of this. Bone density, scanning all of your organs, blood work, everything that you can imagine, they look at. And then if they find something and medically disqualify you, they will let you know that you are medically disqualified and what the issue is. And you can imagine some people find out some really interesting and sometimes sad news about themselves that they did not know. And then you go home and you wait for a yes/no phone call. And so from the time I applied, the applications were due in July of 2008. I did my first interview in, I'm trying to think, fall of 2008. Then I went home and waited. And then actually, it was January of 2009, I did my first interview. And then I waited, had my birthday, got called back in April for the second interview, and didn't get notified until July 2009. So it was a full year between applying and getting that yes/no phone call. And that yes/no phone call came from astronaut Sunita Williams. And so even though I didn't get selected, it was great that she was really nice on the phone and encouraged me to apply again. And so out of the 2009 selection process, 9 astronauts were selected. From the 47 finalists, we got down to 9. And so it was a lot of people apply, but only a few people get selected, obviously. And so this is kind of the pipeline. These are two diagrams that represent the same thing. And this whole idea of that you got a lot of people who apply, but they get rejected in some way. And when you look at how that happens, you've got all these people who's highly qualified. Down here, you're getting percentile wise down to less than 1% from the actual pool. And when we look at that, your chances of getting selected, and I just used the last 3 selections, and the number of applicants have gone up. Now in 2021 selection, this is 2020, but the actual astronaut selection will happen in 2021. You're looking at 12,000, and number here. What we would like to see is this number go up. Historically, when the shuttle was running, astronaut classes that were 35, 40 people selected at once. But once the shuttle retired, the number dropped quickly. And so you can see this being the first class, they only selected 9 astronauts because the ISS, the US only had so many slots. You're flying on, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go back. You're only so many seats available. And so those numbers have been low. This diagram on the left is really interesting. So let's just take a moment to look at it, because it's a compilation of who has been selected over time and the age. And you can see along the bottom here, the age of selection. And so the sweet spot typically is between 31 to 39. So in your 30s, it doesn't mean that you can't get selected when you're in your 40s. It just means that your chances are lower. And this one at 47, this was actually Barbara Morgan, who was a special case. Some of you guys might remember that when Christy McAuliffe was the first teacher in space who died tragically in a Challenger accident. Well, Barbara Morgan was her backup. And when they brought back the teacher in space program, she actually applied as a civilian, was selected, and flew officially as the first teacher in space. But what's interesting here is that you can see the colors represent whether they're military. And you guys hear that feedback? I don't know if you guys hear that, but I'm hearing feedback. Okay, and then you can see whether you're male or female. And so if you look at this and you see a solid color, then that's going to be a female, and it's blue, then they're navy. And so you can really see, how many people are military versus civilian. And then what's interesting is the number that is filled in the circle is number of flights. And so a lot of times you think, oh, you're going to get a chance to fly, but you can see in here that there are zeros. And so even though you get selected as an astronaut, one of the things that NASA specifically lets you know is that there is a good chance that you might not fly. And that's something that you have to also deal with, is that getting selected and flying aren't necessarily correlated together. But right here is what 34 has the highest number of people selected at that age. And so for females, being a female, I'm always interested in the numbers for females. And the big thing is that numbers are on the rise. And so when we look at the history of NASA on the left and the number of women, we can see the selection process, all male. And then when we start to see females coming in, we can see that the cohort number 21, you had half of it was male, half of it was female. Only 8 were selected at that time, so 4 and 4. And then again in the cohort 22. It will be interesting to see if cohort 23 will be the first where the majority is actually female or not. And then on the right is kind of the history of females and flying and space since Valentina. And so how many females have flown in space, and of course the United States leads in that. One of the things that is coming up is private industry and the ability to fly with commercial. And so when we look at the dollars spent, now this is, looking at global investment into space versus private. And so private, when we're talking about billions of dollars, still doesn't have the capital that a nation has that can put behind space. But if you look at on the right here, from 2000 to 2006, and then 2007 to 2012, the amount of dollars that are coming in through private is ever increasing. And and even NASA, is basically moving towards private industry, taking a lot of the burden of our space program. And so for me, I hope that private industry will be my ticket to space before I pass away, and that I'll get an opportunity to go to the moon. So for the daily webinar challenge, these are the questions that I thought were most interesting. What type of skills should we be considering for Artemis? If we're going to the moon, if we're going to build a moon base, how diverse does that skill set need to be? And as a geologist, I hope it's a ton of geologists that we send there. Diversity and inclusion. Are they important that we have diversity and inclusion when selecting our astronaut class? Why or why not? And we know that the history is not necessarily inclusive and diverse. The idea of space for everyone, is that true? How important do you think that is? And then who is currently not being considered that should be? You're in a STEM field, but so things that don't qualify, psychology doesn't qualify, geography doesn't qualify, the arts don't qualify. So it's one of those things of, should we be considering things outside the normal STEM field that is currently part of the astronaut selection? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cyan. That was fantastic. I'm going to give you a round of applause. That was really, really great. So we're going to open it up to the panel now. Just a quick moderator's note. I know some people find it easier to keep track of only who's talking. So you can actually adjust your view at the top. There's a view that says view everyone, view who's talking, view the active cameras. So just want to mention that note. So to open it up to the panelists, my question is, what was your mindset when applying? How many times did you apply? Did you apply before you knew you were qualified? And what was your rationale? We just want to get some insight into what made you apply. Did you think, oh my gosh, I got this, I'm the next NASA astronaut? So Uli, we'll start with you, then Kyle, then Bailey, and then we'll go back to Cyan if she has anything to add.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? Great. So yeah, I applied for the first time for the 2017 class. I had finished my PhD in 2015 in geological sciences, and so I wanted to just go for it. I hadn't done it before. I didn't know what the process involved. So I found it quite interesting that it was run through USA Jobs, and then it really was a resume that you had to put in all the different experiences. So actually navigating that one and figuring out how do I best represent myself was challenging. I did apply again this year. Last time I made it into the top 120 semi-finalist. So I did interview. And so it was quite an interesting and intense experience because the interview was done right after I got out of NASA HERA. HERA is this human exploration research analog. So I'd been in isolation and confinement with 3 other people for a month. And then when I was in the habitat, I actually got a phone call. So they're like, the commander needs to report to the airlock. And I'm like, oh no, I'm getting kicked out. What did I do? So I listen in on this call, and it's from Johnson Space Center saying, we want to interview you. And I'm like, what? Like, I hadn't heard anything. And actually one of the team members for our HERA mission had to drop out before we even did the mission because he was being interviewed. So then I'm like, oh, I knew I was highly qualified because my references have been contacted, but I thought that was it. So but I was happy with that because it was the first time applying. So then just being able to interview was an amazing experience. And That's as far as I got the first time, and I was extremely happy with that. Gained a lot of valuable insights. And really, when they say be yourself in the interview, it's absolutely the best advice. Be who you are, represent who you are, all the skill sets you have. And since that interview, I've just been working on many different things, including mountaineering. I'm more a mountaineer than an underwater person or flight, even though I have experience in a little experience in both of those. Where I found being able to be a good leader and follower is in mountaineering. So that's what I've been pursuing and running expeditions.
Kyle, you're muted.
Kyle, over to you. Oh, we'll try. Okay, there you are.
All right. So I've applied 3 times to be an astronaut. I know the outcome of 2 of them. We'll see how the third one goes. The first 2 times, let's see, I applied in 2013 and in 2017. Each time I reached the basic qualification level. So I've never had my references contacted. I'm hoping that's a little bit different this time. When I first applied, I had just finished up my master's degree in Earth Systems Science with a bachelor's degree in imaging science, sort of a remote sensing related field. In 2017, when I was submitting my application, I was actually in the process to go get ready to go support a Hera mission, much like Uli had done. And so it's always been an interesting kind of sequence of timing. It's like, did I just accomplish something? NASA's very interested in knowing what you have done and not what you're going to do. Going to do is unwritten. Anybody can say they're going to go do something. They're looking for, yeah, you actually did this. So that was kind of an interesting thing working against me in terms of sampling rate for the past selections. However, in the intervening period between those selections and this one, I've done a lot of interesting things. I've gone back to grad school. I'm working on a PhD right now at George Mason. I've taken more classes through Project PoSSUM, doing a geology field school, learning about life support systems, testing extravehicular activity spacesuits, and working with some other folks here on the conference call doing other sorts of analog missions, including an underwater analog. I lived underwater for 5 days. That was pretty cool, and there's not a lot of people who have that experience. So I'm hoping that works in my favor for this time around in selection.
Thanks for that, Kyle. Bailey, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I've applied once, and as of right now, NASA has never told me I cannot be an astronaut because I'm still waiting to hear back on that one. All the other times that I've applied, or that I could have applied in the past, I was still in school, so it didn't really make sense. As Shauna mentioned, I'm currently pursuing my master's, so I don't know if that qualifies me or not this time around. I can get it before the end of the application process, so I'm hoping that doesn't leave me underqualified. In general, I think my thought process this time around was 0.1% is better than 0% in terms of a chance to become an astronaut. So that's kind of where I came at it from this of who knows if this will work or not, but it's going to be a really fun experience. If you look, I posted a video of me going through the application process. So if you look that up, you can see the entire time I was like, I am so underqualified watching all these accomplishments and listening to everyone else. Just like Kyle said, they're not interested in what you're going to do. And as of right now, pretty much all of my career is in front of me. So hopefully I can start tailoring it to what they want and what they want to see. Like you said, I'm trying to get my pilot's license in all these different areas. But as of right now, I'm kind of a blank slate.
Thanks so much for that, Bailey. And that was really well phrased. You missed 100% of the shots you don't take. So 0.01% is still a chance. Cyan, before we turn it over to the next question, do you have anything to add to what was said there?
No, I think that everybody pretty much nailed it. I will say that I did apply again and I made the highly qualified, but I did not get an interview. And so, but one of the things that, like Bailey was saying, is they want to see that you are persistent. Jessica Meir, she didn't get selected in my class. She got selected the next time. She came back and reapplied. And that is, I hear that a lot of the astronauts who finally get selected. it's perseverance, it's continuing to work on your skill sets. They want to know that you have the resilience to come back, all of those kinds of things.
Perfect. And so, and I know there's lots of people on this call with their own experiences applying. So if you want to type those in the chat, if you want to tag us on social media using the hashtag PoSSUM Astronaut Mentality, I've put all of our speakers' tags on the chat. So we would love to hear from you. So I'm actually going to turn it over to an audience question before we go on to the other moderator questions. So Angela asks, I notice a lot of men are selected, although the number of women being selected is on the rise. Has there been specific factors that hinder more women from being selected today, or is the process exactly the same for both genders? So who wants to address that?
I will say that the process was the same when I went through it, whether you're a male or female. But I think the difference is going back to Mercury 13 and the women who were trying to be part of the Apollo missions, is that there are more women in leadership and more women being, given the opportunity to show that we have what it takes. And so my experience, I think, has been that as women are supporting women, as more women are graduating with college degrees than males now, and coming up in STEM fields, that we're just going to see a lot more females. And now NASA wants to put a female on the moon. And so this upcoming selection process, I really think that it could be the first time where it's more women than men.
That would be something to see. So here's a question that actually I wondered about. And so for those of you who have applied, how has the application process changed your life direction, your daily skill set? Like, is there something that you took away from the last selection? You're like, okay, I want to keep doing this, in my daily life. Like, was it a skill set that you didn't have that maybe you wanted to pick up and that you still practice? So just wanted to throw that out there. Bailey, this time we'll start with you.
Well, like I said, I'm still pretty new to this whole process. So I did make a 2020 goal to get my scuba certification this year. So you guys can check back in December of this year to make sure I did that. And trying to get my pilot's license, those kind of stemmed from this astronaut thing. The thing I learned from this time around, talking to people like Cyan and just looking at other applications and stuff like that, an area that I feel like I'm lacking is like science and like scientific research. So I think my future is going to try to get into more science. I'm an engineer, which is, as many of you know, engineering and science is like that research aspect is very different. So I'm hoping with PoSSUM to do some like actual research, maybe through my master's program, maybe get a paper out there or something like that. So that's a personal goal that I've set that I have no idea how to achieve yet, but hopefully that kind of shakes things up a little.
Awesome. Uliana, I see that you wanted to respond.
I jumped the gun. I put on my microphone. But yeah, I kind of like just looking at my past application and where I am now. So mountaineering is a very expensive hobby, right? So I've kind of been like just limited to being able to pursue that and doing the best I can within that realm. But I think like actually having operational skills, technical skills, whatever capacity you can do those in is very important. So I am also working on more flight experience and scuba. And something recently I took up is polar guiding, so learning how to drive boats just to have more operational experience in that capacity, as well as I carry a rifle in the Arctic, so just like anything that that forces you to kind of really expand your horizons, and also anything you can do that demonstrates both leadership and your ability to follow and be part of a team is very important.
How do you not have your own movie franchise series yet? That's amazing.
Actually, no.
I'm glad you asked. So Kyle looks like he has something to say.
So one thing that I'd like to add to all of this, I'm really liking the answers. I especially like Uli's comment about pursuing operational experience and leadership experience. That's 110% correct. I think that's the right way to go. One thing that I've always heard from folks who have been successful in their applications is that you need to make sure that you're establishing a career for yourself that will be satisfying even if you don't become an astronaut. There's been 100 billion people who have ever lived on the planet, and less than 1,000 of them have ever been to space. So odds are you're living on this rock. So you need to make sure that you're building a foundation for success for yourself that is not predicated on going to space. So basically, build yourself up, find these operations, find this leadership experience, and make sure that you're having a satisfying career for yourself. If the astronaut thing happens, it'll be because you found that success for yourself. Don't just try and chase being an astronaut full bore the entire time. You need to be able to do other things to be successful in your life. That's been one of the big things that I've tried to focus on. Would I love to go to space? Absolutely. Are the odds against me? Absolutely. I'm going to try and find a way to be successful wherever I am. I think that's a big goal.
That's perfect. Kyle, you said something I want to touch on and open up to the panel, but first I just want to take a couple questions and comments. So I see Ken Hernandez from Melbourne Beach, Florida. He said that the application process pushed him to work on his diving certification, and he's actually now a master diver. So Ken, that's amazing. And then Ken also asks, do we know the percentage of applicants in terms of gender breakdown, males versus females? Cyan, did you have a slide on that? No, we don't know yet.
No.
Okay, and then I just wanted to give a shout out to, I see that Tikshna is 9. So we have a very, very varied range of audience members here from all around the world. We have people from Greece, Russia, India, Canada. So just wanted to give a special shout out. Thanks for making the time to attend. So I'm going to come back to a question that, one just popped up. So we'll just get to the point I want to bring up that Kyle made, is what exactly, you touched on this, what exactly does it mean to have the astronaut mentality? Because Cyan, in your presentation, you said it's not just going to space, you may never fly, like you're doing day-to-day stuff. And then Kyle, you said forge a career for yourself that you'll be happy with. So if we were to encapsulate that in the phrase astronaut mentality, like what does that mean to you? Kyle, we'll start with you since you brought it up.
To me, the astronaut mentality is staying calm in situations that may be very tense, keeping big picture, sense of being able to make contributions to positive outcomes despite circumstances, finding ways to be part of the solution and not the problem, and helping others to be successful in the same sort of way. I think that's kind of the core spirit of the astronaut mentality, from my perspective.
Perfect. Bailey, over to you. Well, what does the astronaut mentality mean to you?
I think Kyle said it pretty well. The one thing I kind of would add is that I think the astronaut mentality, or who astronauts are kind of the representation of humanity in space. So I think it's kind of, you need to be that team player. You need to be the best representation of all the good things we have, the perseverance, the integrity, all those kind of things. That is more than just technical. It's kind of the people side, and the humanity side of it all that I think really true astronauts kind of encompass.
Cyan or Uli, anything to add to that?
I agree with all that's been said. Absolutely being able to be a people person, because these missions are going to be long duration. And like NASA Harris showed, when you're locked in for 30 days with strangers, can you actually manage that stress within those kinds of realms? And also being able to be flexible and be able to adapt to situations and to jump in when you're needed in any role that may be.
Perfect. So I see we have a couple more questions in the chat. So M. Benekis says, generalist versus specialist. Selection used to be in favor of the former, so generalists. Will we see a shift in the latter now towards specialists? Any thoughts on that from the panel?
Well, I will say that the history of NASA has been towards the engineer side. And so when Bailey, you were talking about that, and Uli about operations, and I see Artemis kind of being the same way, because you're building, again, a moon station, a base. So being an engineer has definitely been favorable for selection, because you can look at all of the military and even their backgrounds. Typically, if you're a fighter pilot, you've got a degree in engineering. And so, but now we're trying to, it's been kind of more of a fight for the sciences to get in there. And you can get selected as a scientist, but it's not as easy. I would say order-wise, it's engineering, medical doctor, then scientist. And so it'll be interesting to see when it, for Artemis, what NASA's thinking. I imagine it is still going to be heavily skewed towards engineering, but that's just my take on that.
Perfect. Any other thoughts?
I have a little bit of a weigh in, kind of like what I'm doing with my master's is kind of exploring how we're going to get a permanent human presence in space. And part of that is kind of looking into history and how we used to do things, watching people sail over to the Americas. They were all sailors, right? And then you finally started having settlers, and then we grew these great populations and everything like that. So I think we're still in the sailor kind of explore generalist phase. And then in the future, we can start going into the specialist when we start getting that presence really established. So if you just kind of like look into history that way, it's a good way to monitor it, I think.
Excellent perspectives. And actually, on that note, Jose Pedro has a question. He's asking, what kind of doctor would be more useful to have in a Moon-Mars mission? And I'm grinning because I obviously have thoughts on this, but panel, go ahead if you have your thoughts.
I apologize. I was looking at the hashtag on Twitter for some great comments from Aaron Vanilla. Could you please repeat the question?
So Jose Pedro is asking, what kind of doctor would be more useful to have in a Moon-Mars mission? Do you have any thoughts?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Based on the previous question, or the previous topic, I'd say you always need a physician. I'm not just saying that to butter you up, Shauna. But in general, I think that anyone who can attain a doctoral level degree, they've shown that they can do research. And they've shown that they can overcome a variety of different forms of adversity, whether that's administrative or technical or all sorts of different kinds. So you always need physicians, but I think that if you can achieve a doctoral degree in any field, you're probably well suited to be able to be successful in a space environment. It shows that you are capable of being organized. It's showing that you can actually take on a large project and get it done. Stuff along those lines.
Absolutely. And I'll weigh in here because for those of you who don't know, my background is medicine. I'm a physician. And so to give you kind of what the Canadian perspective, in the last CSA selection, some specialists, some surgeons, some pathologists had made it into the top 72, the top 100. But by the time you went to the selection beyond that, it was all generalists. And so basically, and this kind of applies to the wider skill set that the panel was alluding to earlier, is that you want a Swiss Army knife of a human being, and that applies to physicians as well. You want someone who can master a wide variety of skill sets because you need to be ready for whatever space, the moon, that Mars is going to throw at you. So ideally, you should be a generalist, but also be able to do the emergency intubation, surgical procedures. I see Preston Fedor has said emergency medicine all the way, so definitely you should be able to deal with the critical things. Kyle, I'll let you, you have something to say as well.
Yeah, it's actually a question for the panel, and it's based on a remark from Twitter using the PoSSUM Astronaut Mentality hashtag from Aaron Vanilla. Aaron writes, NASA should open up astronaut selection qualifications to include people of different academic backgrounds, not just STEM or military, and add weight to resiliency and life experiences. As something to add on to that, if you take a look at the degree qualifications for NASA, there's a set of degrees that are considered qualifying and a set of degrees that are not considered qualifying. There's one that's always kind of struck me as surprising, and that's that NASA does not consider degrees in nursing to be qualified. Just as a question to the rest of the panel, I'm wondering if any of you have any insight as to why. It doesn't make sense to me, and I'm curious about perspectives on that.
I think Canadian selection did include nursing last time, so that's very interesting to hear. So anyone who's ever worked with a nurse knows that they are your glue. They're the mortar between the bricks. So that's very interesting to hear. Any thoughts on that for the rest of the panel?
Well, at the very least, a shout out to all the doctors and the nurses out there currently supporting everything in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And that's a perfect segue towards the end of the panel, because at the end of the day, the whole reason that we wanted to bring up the astronaut mentality is because we think a lot of these skill sets and mindsets are super relevant to life during a pandemic. So in the last few minutes here to wrap up, let's just do a quick round table, starting with Cyan. What are a couple key, like 2 lines of the key astronaut mentality that we discussed today that you think that people could be applying to life during a pandemic, whether it's trying to be resourceful or stay at home and deal with isolation confinement? Cyan, go ahead.
I guess I would say that getting to know yourself, being resilient, self-reflective, those are all good things, but also being a tinkerer and a lifelong learner, and, you know, going to that Swiss Army knife mentality of knowing a little bit of everything, and don't be afraid to take something apart and try to put it back together, because those are some of the skills that while you're at home, if you need, there's something that needs to be fixed or things like that, to get outside of your comfort zone. If you're not an engineer, or if you're an engineer and you want to do science, there's kinds of science experiments that you can do right there at your home, and just to expand your knowledge.
Perfect. Bailey, any thoughts?
Kind of like what Cyan was saying about tinkering, I do have to share that I completely took apart my vacuum cleaner and cleaned it during quarantine. So I know how vacuum cleaner works pretty well now. So I think that's definitely, like you're saying, part of it. Personally, I've been working on my self-reflection side, and kind of monitoring both myself and like my resources and stuff like that. So I do a lot of reflection on if I'm feeling good that day, if I'm feeling bad, what that means, where I can improve. And because everything else in my life is quiet right now, I can really focus on me and what I need. So that's been actually really fun to do through all this. Yeah, and I think that's just kind of the general of it, is get to know yourself and be comfortable with yourself.
Perfect. Kyle?
I think communications is a big part of it. We send people into space, not just because they want to go. We send them to go do things and perform research and to explore. And one of the big things about exploration is worthless unless you actually come back and tell someone about what you found. So that's not only the nuts and bolts, the technical science aspects and the engineering aspects, but it's also about the human experience. So I think a big part of it is communications, being able to convey information to others, to be able to share the experience with others. One of the astronauts that I've always kind of looked up to, that I've always held in high esteem, is Alan Bean. Alan Bean was an engineer, he was a test pilot, he walked on the moon, he came back. When he retired from NASA, he became a painter. And he painted all sorts of different paintings just to try and convey the ephemeral qualities of what it's like to be in that environment, and in a way that no other astronaut had really done prior to that point. And I thought that was super, super cool. So for me, it's communication.
Thanks for that, Kyle. And last but not least, Uliana.
Yeah, so I think taking the time really to learn new skills, it's a great opportunity for it. So back in November, I got this subscription to Masterclass, and then I was so busy with guiding and teaching that I didn't have a chance to really use it, right? So now I'm using the time to take a look at all those classes. Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, has a masterclass up there. So using the time to just learn lots of different things, working on languages, and then also really important when dealing with the pandemic is really keeping healthy. So the food you eat, like I'm cooking a lot more new recipes, it's been really fun. And also keeping healthy physically as much as possible. We can still get out here in Colorado, we can go for walks and bike rides, but if you're at home, you can still have a home gym, lift weights, do body weight exercises. So keeping yourself strong physically as well as mentally is very key right now.
Perfect. So with that brings us to the end of our session. Sheila, you were so right. An hour just zooms by at light speed. So thank you all for attending. We had great numbers again today. So just to remind you, the participation does not end at once this webinar is over. We do want to keep hearing from you and your experience and your comments. Remember, science challenge questions. Number 1, what kind of skills should we be considering for Artemis? Number 2, is diversity and inclusion important when we're talking about selection? Why or why not? And number 3, who is currently not being considered, like artists or nurses who should be? So reach out to us, particularly if you're on Twitter, use the hashtag PoSSUM Astronaut Mentality, and we'll look out for your answers and read them at the start of tomorrow's webinar, same time, same place. We'll put out a link on social media to remind you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the one, the only Shayla.
Yes, thank you, Shauna. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. Awesome job moderating, Shauna. And for tomorrow's webinar, is anybody out there, lessons on isolation from Mars, analog and ice environments? That is the webinar for tomorrow's title, where we'll have some experienced analog astronauts share their stories. Team PoSSUM is signing out.
All right. Bye, everyone. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Social distance.